Dragger, an original novel by Robert Napier, narration and images powered by AI. Chapter 2, A Girl of Her Word. Dex had never witnessed such cruelty, not even to an animal, at least, not that she could remember. Crouched between the walls, she tried to focus on things she knew, just as dreams flee from the mind. She almost remembered her mother and her home. She remembered tall grass and shadows on the water, but when she tried to see more clearly, there was only fire and smoke and screams. She squeezed her head, more from frustration than any pain. There was blood beneath her hair. She winced to touch the tender spot just above her left temple. The bruising ran straight back to the swirl in her scalp. She didn't know how that happened. How can you hurt your head so hard it bleeds and not know? Not only had she somehow gotten hurt, she had also forgotten how she'd done it. But otherwise, she felt no remorse for what she couldn't remember. Here, in this dark, in-betweenishness, she had nothing to remind her of any loss, no evidence that she had ever been anywhere but here. The only thing she was certain of was that her name was Dex. That had been made quite clear, and that would have to be enough. There was some banging and scraping coming through the cracks. Dex looked again and saw two of General Dragger's war ghouls taking the dead man away. He was motionless. There was blood covering his leg. He was sweating, even though the air was damp and chill. They took him out of sight. She was sure she had known him. She hadn't given it much thought when she heard noises again, this time down and to her right. As her eyes adjusted to the dark, she found herself nestled against a dusty wad of rags. She tried to push past, but her hand broke through a brittle crust and released a foul cloud of filth, barely keeping her balance. A mummified skull tumbled into her lap, followed by a cascade of moldy clothes, a mass of hair, and several floating ribs. Dex lost her composure, tried going up and down at the same time, twisted round, and frantically tried to brush away the swirl of decayed skin floating in her hair and face. In all the fuss, she lost her footing and slid down a chute, scratching and bruising every bend of her body. When she finally came to rest, she felt her best option was to lie motionless until she could reassess the situation. Little by little, she discovered that with a bit of wiggling, she could drop to a lower level and peer through a hole in the stonework into another dark chamber. Torches were brought into that darkness, opening it up like overripe fruit. The war ghouls hauled their prisoner there and dumped him on the stony clay. One of the creatures dropped a torch beside the prisoner. They admired their work for a moment, then went away. The sound of heavy doors shutting resonated through the empty chamber. The man lay on the ground for a long time. Dex wasn't so much interested in him as she was in trying to avoid going back into the sty. All that time, the man never moved, and Dex was convinced that he was actually dead. She was not overwhelmed by curiosity or compassion, but this man was the only thing she sensed any kind of remembrance from. More bored than anything, she wiggled a little more and was able to fit through the hole in the wall and plop into the chamber. The torch on the floor was barely glowing. There was no danger of the fire spreading, as everywhere was solid stone, slick with drainage. She rekindled it a bit by waving it wildly in the air. She was more captivated by this whipping and light play than the prisoner, and had forgotten he was there. So when someone grabbed her ankle, she nearly fainted or screamed. Her mind couldn't decide which, and ultimately, she did neither. But it took some effort to start breathing again. "Who are you?" the frail voice asked. "I guess my name is Dex." "Where am I?" he whispered. Dex had no way to begin to answer, so she repeated what she had been told. "Welcome to Gnarlstead. We're all trapped here." The man groaned and was silent for a while. Dex squatted down beside him, shining the light in his face. He turned away, throwing his arm over his eyes. Dex thought this was a reaction to the torch being too close, so she found a spot on the wall to wedge it. This took time and effort, as she thought she had found a good spot, only to have the torch tumble onto the floor. She would scramble to pick it up, only to have 4 times, she had to wedge it into the wall, but she got it to stay reasonably well and was proud of the effect. When she turned around, the man was standing behind her. She startled again. She had stuck the torch only as high as she could reach, and this meant the light shone about hip level on the grown man. After all her hard work, he took the torch off the wall and began to walk around the chamber with it. He examined the large iron doors, all 4 corners of the room, and crisscrossed the floor. Dex followed behind him. Again, this wasn't out of curiosity. She just didn't like the dark, and he had the torch. Finally, he faced her. He held the torch just above her, so he could see her face. "Are you a prisoner here?" he asked skeptically. Dex wasn't sure. "How did you get in here?" Dex thought she pointed at the hole in the wall, but it was dark everywhere, except where they stood, and she had become quite lost. Before the panic could totally paralyze her, the man put his hand on her head. The weight and warmth were reassuring, and she thought perhaps everything was fine. But by his rough handling, she realized he was examining the cuts on her head. In the torchlight, she shoved his hand off of her. "Who are you, anyway?" "What does it matter?" he said distantly. "Would you know if I told you?" Dex couldn't remember much, but she knew rudeness when she heard it. "Do you know who Dex is?" She sneered at him. "I doubt you even do." The man laughed at her, which she hated. She would have gone right back through her hole if she knew where it was. "I'm Lord Tyrek, Sullen Dweller of the Jozen, Knight of the Vinian Order, Commander of the Deltaic Legion, and a prisoner of Gnarlstead, apparently." Dex thought about all of that very seriously, then said, "So, Lord Trexold, Welda Jazen Knight, Dander Leishan, we're the same." He shook his head, confused. "What do you mean?" "We're fucked." He laughed at her again, but she had meant it. "I guess you're right," he conceded. "We are that. But how did you get here?" "Through a hole in the wall." "Can you show me?" "All right." Dex brought him with some difficulty to the place. He examined the portal diligently, going over and over the edges of it with the torchlight. Finally, his head dropped with despair. There was no way he could climb through, and no way could he loosen the stonework with his bare hands. "Maybe in 100 years, he sighed. To show him how it was done, she hopped up and went through to the other side. It wasn't even hard. She hoped that would make him feel better. But his face was stern. "I don't think you're supposed to be here," he said. Dex really didn't know where she wasn't supposed to be, so she didn't answer. "Look, I'm sorry I got you into this." Dex didn't understand, and she blinked hard at him. "Do you know me?" she asked. "No," he said. "Oh, no. I mean, not really. We met before." Dex continued to blink at him. "The village? You were, looking for your mother, I think." Dex squinted. His face was familiar. She was sure of it, but just the outline. "What village?" "Nethertyne. That's where you're from, isn't it?" "I'm from Gnarlstead. I'm Dex." She felt bad correcting him, but it was for the best. "No. I mean before that." "I don't know," she said flatly. She really wasn't worried about where she had been, except so far Gnarlstead had been a miserable place, and she was fairly sure she wanted to go somewhere else. "Can we go to Nethertyne?" The word sounded good, and she had no trouble remembering it. "No," he said, scratching his head. "We can't. I mean, even if we could, we can't." "Oh," Dex said. She had already learned not to expect much from people. "It's not that," he said softly. "It's just, don't you remember? I remember the horses, and the soldiers, and the fur coat, and the campfires, and Mud, and Aunt Ruby, and Vago, and the water, and the piglets, and the bone mask, and the naked people turning into war ghouls, and..." Tyrek stopped her there, as it became clear she was just naming anything that came to mind. "But what do you remember about Nethertyne?" Dex shrugged. "I don't know. It's your village." No, it isn't. It's your village. Or it was, before Draggr destroyed it." "You mean my father?" "Father?" Tyrek gagged on the idea. "Is that what he told you?" Dex shrugged. "No, that's a lie. Fathers don't lie," she insisted, though she didn't know anything of the sort. She was just sick of being contradicted all the time. Tyrek saw that he wasn't getting anywhere with the obstinate child. He only felt great pity for her, and guilt. "Look, Dex, you must go now. It's not safe for you here." "All right," she said, taking his word on it. She vanished. Tyrek was startled at how fast she had gone. Then the deep isolation of the dark chamber settled around him, and he dashed forward. Hey, come back! What? She said, only a few feet away, still unsure of where she had left that hole. Come back when you can, but make sure it's safe and nobody knows. Why? I need to tell you where you came from. Just don't believe what Draggr tells you. Not all of it. Well, how will I know what to believe? Better to believe none of it than the wrong parts of it. All right, she agreed, but not really. Tyrek took her by the hand and led her to the hole in the wall. Dex didn't go back the next day or the day after that. She hardly even thought about it. She was very busy with her suffering. No one came to check on her. She was left all alone with the piglets and the bugs. She spent most of her time in the small apartment. Whoever had been the previous occupant of this enclosure, Dex felt acutely that they had never left. Likely, they had starved to death or fed themselves to the gores. It was some comfort that the area was fenced off from the boisterous animals, though, but nothing could stop the beetles and the flies and worms from infesting every possible crevice. She tried fighting them at first, but there were too many, and they were not afraid of her. By the time she realized no one was going to bring her food or water, she was already starving. She had taken to eating the worms, as they were easiest to catch, and she could swallow them without the nasty crunching. She ate as many as her stomach could handle before revolting against the very idea and expelling the slithering mass. She could think of nothing else but food. She lay on her straw mat and groaned and cried. She wondered if life had always been so empty and gross, and if it had, how she had carried on with it. The piglets were fed twice a day by dumping a slurry of grasses, grain, bones, skin, blood, crusts, rotten vegetables, and mysterious trash through the chutes in the ceiling. It took perhaps a week of starvation before Dex even considered trying it for food. When she could no longer bear the pain of hunger, she ventured into the mud pit. In the scarce light, she scavenged for anything to eat, anything. She could not find a single scrap. The ravenous animals ate everything they could get hold of. Their growth was astonishing. They were almost as tall as her now. She had no choice but to wait for the next feeding and try to get ahead of them. That proved impossible, however. The animals knew the sounds of approaching food, and they could hear and smell it far in advance of her. The first 2 times she tried, she found that the animals were already swarming under the vents, long before the slurry arrived, and she was terrified by the squealing and bashing of the mob. There were at least 20 of the gores, and they were visibly bigger every day. When Dex sat on the ledge of her apartment and watched them slumber and snore in the sunny spots, she swore she could see them expanding, especially their dagger-like tusks. The idea of getting between a gore and a scrap of food was terrifying, but the hunger only increased. The gores were smart too. They got faster and tidier about climbing around the area. They recognized each other in their games. They hid things from each other, though they often forgot where. She couldn't overpower them, nor see or smell or even hear better than them. She would somehow have to be smarter. Her first idea was not graceful, but it worked well enough. There was an old chair in her apartment. She never sat on it, as it was rotting and unstable. It was simply a collection of wooden rods tied together with thick twine. She dismantled it. She used one of the chair legs as a club to poke and slap her way into the feeding frenzy. She had already learned that the piglets were most sensitive at the end of their snouts. By targeting this area, she was able to reach the fringe of the food pile and snatch small, edible bits before being squeezed out by the animals. They didn't seem to mind her at all. They took her clubbing as a game and soon learned to avoid her. In turn, she did not begrudge them their appetites. She understood their hunger and their aggression. She did far less harm to them than they did to each other. She even took pity on one of them, the smallest, the runt. Even as a runt, he outweighed her by double. He was leaner than the others, with his ribs beginning to show above his spindly legs. The poor darling had been unlucky against the needle-sharp tusks of his siblings. One of his eyes had been badly cut just above the socket. The eye itself remained intact, but took on a dull milkiness. Whether the damage was severe or not, it did seem to hinder the creature, demoralize it. He could not compete with the fearlessness of his mates, who never knew such a wound. Dex couldn't help but sense a kindred spirit in this handicapped creature. But if she was going to snatch enough food for herself and the runt, she would need a better strategy. The food she had managed to get through roughness motivated her and gave her just enough reprieve to watch and to think. Her new plan was less bold, but far safer. By overlapping the legs of the chair a little, she was able to bind them with the twine. She then used the seat of the chair as a net at the end of the combined rods. This took most of the day. When the gores began to gather for the feeding time, she climbed up on the tall tier and waited, lying on her stomach. As the food was dumped from the ceiling, she extended the net. It barely reached far enough, but a few drops landed on the chair seat. She quickly pulled it in. She had caught wads of soggy bread and the leafy ends of several carrots. Besides being dirty, they were relatively fresh. She quickly shoved half the morsels into her mouth. She barely chewed before swallowing. She could not believe her luck. It had worked, though it was difficult. She was able to share this windfall with her malnourished friend. She resolved to try again at the next feeding time. Again, she waited on her stomach. She caught even more food this time. It was small and foul-tasting, but it gave her hope. After 2 days of eating this way, she stuck the net out too far, and the thick, falling glop broke through the chair seat and pulled it out of her hands. It fell into the swirl of hungry pigs, and every bit of her invention was devoured. She would have to think of something else. She knew she couldn't keep smacking snouts for much longer. She retreated to her apartment in defeat, but not despair. The little runty pig followed her up to the fence he couldn't cross. Dex sat on the fence and rested her feet on his back for a while, letting the baby bristles tickle her toes. If not for the impossibility of picking the piglet up over the fence, she might have brought him into her apartment right away. But this fact gave her time to reflect on the idea. She realized the runt that couldn't overpower his siblings could very easily smash everything in her room, and it occurred to her that he might try to squeeze through the hole in the wall and hurt himself in a fall. Then she realized the previous owner of her apartment was likely the dusty bones wedged between the walls. This, of course, reminded her that she had agreed to visit the dead man down there. She had forgotten all about him. With nothing to pass the time, now that she was not quite starving, she decided to make good on her agreement. Dex, she figured, was a girl of her word.
Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe.